guess the first question may be a bit obvious to you guys, but I think it'd be great for the audience to understand what marketing really is in a startup or a scale up. Who wants to start? Jalin, should we start with you?
Yeah, happily. So definitions of marketing, it's a really good first question, because definitions of marketing differ, and actually that causes a bit of friction. I think often founders, CEOs, companies have one view, the market has another view, and it takes a while to bash it out. So it is worth thrashing out quite explicitly at the beginning. And just to, I guess, the way I think about marketing, the definition I use is that it's taking the product to the customer using one-to-many channels. Then the question is, what counts as one-to-many channels? And that's where the sort of, I guess, the discussion kicks in. The narrow definition is that it's all of the obvious marketing stuff. It's like, paid marketing and SEO and content and the rest of it. There are broader definitions that might encompass the website as well and the funnel. So sometimes marketing owns the website and other bits of the funnel to sign up and beyond. Sometimes it doesn't, or it has half responsibility. And sometimes marketing encompasses other one-to-many channels that are sometimes in other functions like partnerships or the product or bits of product, at which point it becomes a growth function. So I guess there's a narrow version of marketing that is just marketing channels. And when we were at Google, I think it's fair to say that we did the narrow version. There's a mid version that might include on-site or on-site upper funnel. So the homepage plus down to sign up, possibly longer. And then there's a large version that might include product or partnerships as well. And it's a really good thing to clarify and agree with the CEO before you start.
Yeah, I guess, Marina, you're on mute. That's the sentence of the
Sorry, I was going to say, that's great. Thank you, Jalin.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition. I think at Google, they used to say marketing is about sort of understanding the user. So there's a lot of that research, qual and quant and data behind that, and understanding the magic, sort of the product and what problems does it solve for the user, and then connecting the two. And so I think that exactly echoes what Jalin was saying, and whether it's the narrow or the broader scope of that.
Yeah, that's a really good definition. Thank you both. And I guess my next question would be, you're both obviously very established marketeers, very successful. Do you have a view of what the key elements of being a CMO are, and what kind of distinguishes a good one from a great one?
Sure. I'll hand over to a great one. So.
And I think building on what we just said, what marketing is, I think a lot of it is about starting with the why, and I think a great CMO always sort of is part of the company objectives and isn't in the silos. So that what Jalin said earlier about defining together with the founders, what is marketing, what's the role of marketing, and how does it build up to what the company is trying to achieve as a whole, is super important as a starting point. And I think as a natural continuation of that, building relationships and connections around the company, kind of with other functions, with tech, with product. In the case of fintech, there's always often a risk function, a data analytics function, sort of ops and customer success, and all kinds of frontline, whoever that is absolutely crucial for marketing because marketing touches all of that. Marketing is all about the communication, right? And so if you don't understand what the users are telling you, or if you don't understand how someone else is talking about it in a one-to-one context in sales, or if you're just generally not driving what the company wants to achieve, it's a bit useless. So I think kind of staying out of that silo and sort of building that broad kind of understanding of what you're trying to achieve is really important. And it's very important as you build a team that everyone in the team gets that it's not like just something that and everyone in the team is just like a soldier focused on their own silo thing, that start with why permeates. Jalin, do you want to add on that?
Agree strongly about starting with why and collaborating across functions. And just to, I guess, overlay on it a bit, there's a lot of data to suggest that CMOs struggle more than other functions. And I don't know if anyone over here has seen that data, but it applies both to the tech industry startup scale-ups and to big companies. So reliably, the data says that if you look at the tenure, if you look at how long CMOs have been in position relative to CTOs, COOs, and all the rest of it, consistently, regardless of whether it's these small companies, regardless of whether it's Europe, regardless of whether it's the US and so on, CMOs are in tenure for less long than any of the other functions. So it's a kind of cursed position. It's difficult to make work. And the natural state of being a CMO is, going by the statistics and having done this multiple times with multiple companies, it is often, there is often a bit of a mismatch or a struggle. And so I would suggest that the ultimate skills are the ones that will land your thinking and position with the CEO and the exec. So it's about building those relationships and stakeholder management. As Viktoria said, I think stakeholder management isn't a marginal thing. It isn't the bit you add on the end, particularly if you're a CMO as opposed to VP marketing or director or whatever. If you are that C-level exec sitting on the exec team, it's a really key part of your skill set, and I think you need to care about it as a C-level exec. So that's the first thing, stakeholder management, which speaks to Viktoria's point about building relationships. To her point about about the why, I think a good CMO is a general business exec who gets marketing. So understanding and fitting within the commercial context, because you are just another exec in the business as well, by the time you're properly in the C-suite, is critical. So yeah, I strongly agree with Viktoria with that overlay of if you don't do stakeholder management, if you don't relate what you're doing to commercial outcomes and do it in a very deep fundamental sense, then you will be in that natural state of CMOs, which is to struggle.
Great, thank you, Jalin. I do agree. I've always wondered why CMOs last so little compared to other people in the senior management. So it's an interesting one, and I know from our perspective, we're definitely seeing a lot of companies really struggle to get the right fit at that level for marketing. I suppose in terms of like the next question, something that I wanted to ask, maybe like two in one. So first, it would be great to understand how your career, led you to becoming a CMO. And then maybe at the same time, we can touch on why did you both move from kind of the big tech at Google into scale-ups, and what challenges did you find in that journey?
Jalin, maybe you start.
So I've ended up as a CMO through two accidents. And the first accident was back in my sort of mid to late 20s when I was a management consultant doing a project in Paris, weekly commuting from Paris to London, which isn't a bad way to live in your late 20s when you're single and the rest of it. I was in the Gare du Nord and bumped into a business school friend, a guy called Arvind Desikan, you might remember because he was at Google Victoria. And Arvind and I had been at this business school together, and we were delighted to see each other in the Eurostar queue. And he was just coming back and from the Frankfurt book fair, because he was product marketing manager for what was then Google Books. He'd been representing Google Books at the Frankfurt book fair. Long story short, we drank beer. There was a seat next to him, so sat next to the guy and drank Belgian beer all the way from Paris to London. And the overwhelming sense that I was left with by the end of the thing, other than I can barely stand, is I really want your job. So I basically tried to get tips about Google from this guy, and being a management consultant and strategist, I was like, I want to do a strategy role, and what do you advise, and so on and so on. And his response was, there is basically no strategy team. In common with most tech companies, strategy barely exists as a function. There was, however, product management that was quite close, but you needed a technical background for that. I didn't have a technical background. So then kind of, if strategy wasn't an option, product management wasn't an option, he said, I'm in this team called European Product Marketing. I guess it's reasonably strategic. Why don't you give it a go? So I applied for the thing, knowing almost nothing about marketing. And I'd sometimes bounce these ideas off Arvind during a very, very attenuated, an application process that dragged on for months for whatever reason. And in that process, I'd sort of say to Arvind, what about this and what about that? And inevitably he'd respond and say, but that's a product idea. So I barely knew what marketing was. Yet somehow, I tell people that Google has a high bar, but I managed to limbo under it and somehow last there for 7 years. So that was the first accident. The second accident was when I was looking to leave Google. I did it in a very risk-averse way. I took a sabbatical, networked with a whole load of startups, got excited about fintech. And I'd go to these startups and founders and so on, and say to them, it was very arrogant. I'd say, your business has two halves. There is a half that builds stuff, and there's the half that distributes and sells stuff. I am the half that distributes and sells stuff. I can do the marketing. I can be a chief operating officer because I've done that sort of thing in operations and strategy at Google. And I am that half of your business. So you're getting a 2-in-1. You're getting a COO and CMO together. That pitch, that line, which I was incredibly proud of, utterly bombed. People, I think, would hear it and imagine that I was really third-rate COO and really third-rate CMO, and you're kind of getting the worst of both rather than the best of both, or some kind of 2-in-1 package. So I went back to the drawing board and started in these conversations testing a COO pitch and a CMO pitch, thinking I was a consultant for 6 years and did operations and strategy for 4 years, so 10 years worth of COO experience, 3 years worth of CMO experience, and it was in Google at 2007 to 10, which is an idiosyncratic environment. So I had very low confidence about the marketing pitch, very high confidence about the COO pitch. And much to my surprise, the CMO pitch went down like 5 times better. There was far more demand for that. And I've essentially stayed that way for the last 7 years.
Well, that's good. I think that sometimes the best experiences come through accidents. What about you, Viktoria? Why did you make the move? I guess from Google to Scaleup.
Yeah, so I joined Google after Jalin. I think we just barely overlapped kind of as he was leaving. And when I joined, it was a small marketing function, relatively speaking, at Google. There were 200 marketeers, and they were very kind of, London was a center of innovation, driving kind of all kinds of pilots across EMEA. It was really fascinating. And I had an amazing ride there for 8 years. But throughout those 8 years, marketing grew 6x in people and like 20x in budget. And the center of gravity very much shifted to the US at some point. To the extent that I found myself as a head of growth marketing, kind of spending 90% of my time pitching stuff to people in Mountain View. And I felt like I wasn't just, wasn't achieving anything, basically. So I started looking around of how can I go to a small place where I can make a bigger impact. And I actually had a lot of conversation with Jalin when he kind of gave me really great advice around the importance of meeting enough people and finding the right founders to work with. And also the importance of sort of finding a company where my skills are really applicable, so that the learning curve of going from a bigger place to a smaller cave isn't compounded by a learning curve of doing a completely different type of marketing that I'm not an expert in. So that, Jan's advice was really invaluable in that. And so serendipitously, I through a fellow sort of research firm of yours, I met with this company that I've been in for the last 4 years. And I was really sort of lucky that I really liked their people, their culture, and also their type of marketing, which was focused on small businesses, was something that I had deep expertise in. And so I was able to step kind of into that CMO role and then learn a lot and kind of like build and expand into sort of things I've never done before, like PR or content. But I think starting from a solid foundation.
That's great. Yeah, Jalin, you're definitely one for good advice. It's not the first time I've heard this. I suppose maybe one for you, Jalin. And you've given that to Viktoria. What sort of advice, do you have for others listening that are looking to make that transition from a bigger corporate into a scale-up?
I'm incredibly flattered. So I barely remember a couple of conversations we had many years ago, Viktoria. But yeah, I'm really.
You're too humble.
So in terms of advice, I've got some marketing advice and some sales advice. The marketing advice is start thinking about yourself as a product, particularly if you're going to go interim and you're going to pitch yourself once a year, twice a year, multiple times a year. And if you do that trick of I am the product, I need to market myself, it makes it psychologically easier than doing the, what's otherwise a slightly embarrassing exercise, and particularly if you're a bit self-conscious, a bit British or a bit, other nationalities. This idea of pitching yourself and touting for business feels embarrassing. Depersonalize it, make yourself the product, and start thinking about your USP, not just as a line to sell, but also what sort of marketing do you enjoy and are you good at? What stages of company might you be better suited at? Are you better when there's a bit of a team there or a lot of a team there, or when there's not much of a team there? Are you better on the performance side and you just want to do like a big performance, like churn the numbers and make this stuff work economically? Or is there team management processes or whatever? So I think work out your USP, lean into it, because you've got this luxury as an interim person of saying, here's what I do. And I don't think it's a bad thing to say, here's what I don't do. Or, you can use more diplomatic language, like you can get cheaper people to do that thing. I use that line a lot. Can you sort my AdWords account out, Jalin? Not, get someone cheaper. Not sort of, revealing the embarrassing truth that in 7 years at Google, I spent no time in AdWords and don't know it very well. So, that tip is to sort out your USP and think about it and test it in the market, because this is a proposition that you're testing just like any other. The second tip, and this goes back to what Viktoria was saying, was meet lots of people, because in the absence of SOS, who I think are the only agency that specialize in interim CMO type work in the startup and scale-up sector, it's fundamentally driven by your relationships. So it's really, really worth cultivating them. Your network is your pipeline.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And yeah, thank you for the marketing of SOS. But I think that's exactly right. And that's exactly why, SOS was launched. So that's very spot on. I guess, does that advice differ in terms of, obviously there's a difference between B2C, business to enterprise, and SMB marketing. Like, how does those differences play into, how you would go about kind of market yourself into a new opportunity?
Victoria, I don't know if you've got thoughts, but certainly on my side, I don't think how you pitch yourself to those businesses matters much. There's probably a bit of a difference by stage in terms of Series A versus Series B and so on. So by stage, just after Series A, companies have landed their first money in the millions for the first time, and their first thought when they get a few million for the first time is, I can afford to spend on marketing. I need a heavyweight marketer. So I think if you're an interim person, you need to work out, given that there are so many people wanting help at that stage specifically, they've just raised Series A, you need to work out whether you're engaging with that stage or it's not really your thing. If you like that stage, there is lots of work that sort of thing around. If not, then you need to sort of elegantly dodge those opportunities, build relationships for other things. But I think going back to B2C versus B2SMB versus B2B, so I think it's less about how you pitch yourself. The work is different. I mean, the risk of saying what anyone who's worked in marketing for a while knows, the customer lifetime values in the consumer sector, it might be $0 to $1,000. Customer lifetime values SMB up to $5,000 or $10,000. In the enterprise space, hundreds or it could be up to hundreds of thousands or millions. And what that means is that when you're selling this enterprise thing that's worth tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, it'll be a process that's usually led by a salesperson. It's a very rare company, although I think it's a brilliant company if it does happen. It's a very rare company that is able to entirely sell and pitch through marketing, non-touch or low-touch channels where there are no humans involved, products worth hundreds of thousands and millions. So given that the norm is that stuff is sold through salespeople, if you do enterprise marketing, you need to be very kind of comfortable and enjoy working with sales. And in a way, being marketing, being handmade in sales. Whereas it's more likely if you're doing B2SMB, you are the key commercial channel. Maybe it's a product-led company, but marketing will be the key thing, getting the stuff out there. In B2SMB, it can go either way. Some B2SMB companies, so I worked with a payments company called Molly in Amsterdam, they're more sales-led, even though they're SMB facing. Others, like our CMO to Tide, the business banking outfit, they're entirely marketing-led. So SMB can be either, and I think as a marketer, maybe I'm biased, but it's better if it's marketing-led because that's more scalable and a lot more scalable, and you can experiment better and so on. But if you're doing the enterprise stuff, it's nice music, someone. If it's if it's on the enterprise side, you're working with sales really extensively.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because we do have, I think we get that question a lot, people that are looking to transition from one to the other and understanding the pros and cons of each is definitely useful. I don't know, Victoria, if you have anything to add to that, or if we should move to the next question.
I completely agree with everything Jalin said. I think the often in an interim role, what people are looking for is a lot of sort of functional and transferable skills around team building, around understanding the fundamentals and the first principles from which marketing works. And I think in that interim situation, whether you've done the exact same thing before doesn't really matter. I think when you look for a full-time permanent role, often, especially like this Series A or even Series B companies, they're looking for someone to come in with a playbook. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt, did it 5 times. I know exactly what to do, don't need to like learn, reinvent the wheel. And I think that means that, you know, people look for a enterprise SaaS playbook or a SMB SaaS playbook or a consumer direct to consumer e-commerce playbook. And I think some companies really do well when you bring in someone with that specific playbook, and some companies are actually, you know, you struggle because the playbook, you know, needs to be tweaked and applied and thought again from first principles. And so I think you need to kind of know whether you're the kind of person who really enjoys, you know, taking a framework or a playbook, whether that's about how to run a team or whether that's about how to do a specific type of marketing to a company. And what you want to do is, you know, apply it and perfect it and sort of grow with it. Or whether you enjoy sort of solving problems from scratch more rather, you know. And so I think that's an interesting balance to think about.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess that relates to the next question. So talking about Interim as well. Jalin, maybe this is one for you. So I guess why did you choose to become an interim CMO, and what would you say, you know, you have been the benefits from this transition, and what kind of advice you'd give to those that want to make a similar move?
Yeah. So in the same way that starting in marketing and then ending up as CMO was an accident, this is also pretty much an accident. And so you know, I guess the very candid version of the story is I left Google in this kind of risk-averse way, taking a sabbatical, networking hard, got excited about fintech, met lots of fintech founders. I was in conversations, or, you know, at offers or very near offers with 3 companies, and I joined the earliest stage, highest risk of them because I thought the founder was an amazing guy. And initially, I started during my sabbatical. I started as a part-time CMO, and then as I resigned from Google, joined as CMO and COO. So I had this kind of dream role of I can do both, and finally, this like both of them together pitch has landed, and so on and so on. And it ended up being a total nightmare. It was you know, like I think I can say this because, you know, the founder's no longer there. Hopefully it's not that easy to sort of work out who this is and the rest of it. It was like being in an abusive relationship, like truly horrendous. And given that I'd left Google for this place and given up a really interesting kind of, rewarding career over there, it was a sort of moment of crisis because I thought everything was good. I'd, you know, spent a bit of time there in an interim capacity. We'd landed funding. Series A was led by Index. I went and pitched their investment committee next to the founder, and they were kind of, you know, throwing money at us, and we felt like really celebrated at that stage. It was a very hot startup of 6-7 years ago. When it didn't work, and I thought, you know, it was horrendous, and I walked out, you know, almost literally walked out before I was there for a year and before, you know, investing or any of this sort of stuff, because it was such a horrendous experience. It was a real crisis of confidence because having been in a startup, I didn't want to go back to a big company, not managing stakeholders and doing things fast and having instant impact and so on. It was addictive. I couldn't give up on that. But at the same time, in spite of having spent lots of time with this guy and thought he was amazing before joining, you couldn't de-risk the joining process. So it felt like being a permanent person is a bit like being, when you're a C-level exec to a founder, it's a bit like being married to them. It's really intense. They really care about what they're doing, and it's a big emotional commitment. And if you can't work out what they're like off a few interviews and so on, in the same way that you wouldn't marry someone off the back of 3-4 dates, so it felt reckless to enter into a C-level permanent relationship off the back of 3-4 interviews. So I was like, I'm just not doing this again, and I need to mitigate the risks to my sanity. So initially, the interim thing was all about risk mitigation and avoiding crazy people and being in a relationship of equals with crazy founders, as opposed to a kind of permanent marriage where they hold all of the power and the rest of it. So that was the starting point. Where it's ended up, though, is in the private equity space, you've got what are called operating executives, where they're brought in as functional experts. They've done this loads of times. They're really business friendly. You bring them in to sort the business out, and you they're there for 6 months, 12 months, sometimes 18 months. So I feel like that. In other words, I think, my ambition is that the people I work with should feel that rather than an interim person being a compromise, being somehow 80% or 70% of the permanent thing, they should look at me as an interim person and feel that I'm 200% or twice as good as the regular person, because you're bringing functional expertise, a whole load of pace and so on. And I enjoy that and the psychological liberation that comes from being able to choose your destiny.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's great. Thank you. Something to ask both. Obviously, you do have, both of you, Viktoria and Jalin, have experience, working with founders, and you both have mentioned the importance of finding the right founder and the right fit with a company. What would you say are your most kind of important learnings and advice for bringing founders on a brand journey and just generally managing that relationship?
I think, first of all, it's building a relationship, actually. And on that, and also even before you sort of start building it, when you decide to go work with a founder, whether on an interim or on a permanent basis, is ensuring, like anyone, that you're going to spend, lots and lots of hours with, a bit like choosing a partner in life, that this is a person that your values are aligned, what success looks like for you and for them is aligned. And also, if often there are several founders in a company, and you want to make sure that that relationship is healthy, and that they complement each other and respect each other. Because if that isn't healthy, the chance of you having a healthy relationship with any of them is really low. So I think kind of doing that sort of very human due diligence, as well as aligning on what success looks like, is really important in general. On brands specifically, I think there is a long continuum of founders that really embody and feel like the brand is an extension of them as a human being. And so they care violently about everything, from the shade of, purple that you're using, to the every word that's large enough on the homepage, to whatever it is. And there are founders that treat it as sort of like, this is the colors and sort of the pretty stuff that I don't care about. I care about the tech, or I care about the product, or I care about the commercials, the sales, whatever. And this is just do whatever you need to do in order to make it work. And you need to figure out where is someone on that spectrum, and be really explicit. Okay, so let's imagine we're going to change the logo. Would you want to sign it off? And I think, I learned the hard way that if you don't ask these questions to begin with, you suddenly think that you are in charge and you're making, smart strategic decisions and whatnot. And suddenly someone comes in and says, this doesn't feel right to me. It's just that curve, it doesn't work. And, and not from someone who's previously expressed any opinions on creative, right? So I think figuring out what is important to them, whether it's the logo, whether it's the name, maybe it's the full Kahoot, and then figuring out how you bring them on the journey. And often there is also an added complication of, this is usually not done in-house, or if it's done in-house, it's done by a design team that often doesn't interact with the CEO as much, or you have an agency partner. And being very thoughtful, very strategic about how we do the communication between all of these people. When do you bring the CEO in, and when you don't? When do you let the agency present, and how much you filter what they present and manage what they present? It's often a very emotional journey, and you need to kind of be really, I think, thoughtful about how you do it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Jalin, do you have anything to add about that, or should we move forward?
I agree totally, and I guess bit of an overlay on it as well. I think of all of the projects you do as a CMO, a rebrand is the weirdest, highest risk project. And it's one of these things where you're going to spend, indicatively, depending on whether the building is in-house or out of house or whatever, you're going to spend like 100 grand. And it's going to take, whatever you say, it's going to take like 6+ months, almost inevitably. And so that's just a vast chunk of your time and your team's time and everyone's emotional energy and so on. So there's loads and loads of emotional energy. And at the end of all of that, it might not look particularly good, or it might or might not have the right commercial impact. So it's a difficult, painful, high-risk thing. And given that, I think there are two mitigation strategies, which Viktoria is essentially talking about. One of them is be really, I think, explicit and mega planned and over-index on the project management structure. it feels strange to go into brand exercise thinking about project management, but actually think, I'm having learned the hard way. You absolutely have to. So it's Viktoria's stuff about, it's going to be in these 3 phases. Let's work out who's going to sign off on both. So typically I have like a close team involved. I know the founder if they really care about this, and some other, head of sales if they really care about things. And then a broader group that involves other founders and this, that, and the other that are involved at other checkpoints. So you involve kind of group 2 at 2 or 3 key checkpoints and give them input but not veto, and group 1 at like 6 checkpoints and give them veto rights as well. Something like that. And you literally agree that stuff, like who's going to be in the groups, what are they going to sign off or not, and then what the project structure looks like. So I think over-indexing and really, really going hard on project management is good. And the second thing is expectation setting, because typically these projects, you do some research at the 3 phase, do some research. In the middle, you'll get to, this is the scariest bit, you'll have like fundamentally a phrase, like literally a few words. And then at the end, that phrase will be turned into a visual and verbal identity that you're bringing to life everywhere. And tell them that this is what's going to happen. And the scariest bit is when you're 30 grand down, 3 months in, and you have 5 words. Just manage expectations that at that point, everyone will be feeling a bit sort of emotionally sort of strung out and wondering why they spent so much money for 5 words. But actually the right 5 words that distill what you're about in a very fundamental sense can be very powerful.
Thank you so much, Jalin. That's great. I guess this question could be directed for both. Obviously, you both have different experiences, but we do have a lot of candidates getting quite apprehensive around the interview process when going through an interim process. And you were saying, Jalin, how very much people can get self-conscious and how good it is to prepare. So, and one question that has come quite a lot is, how do you really plan for your first 30 days on a role?
First 30 days in a role, it's a really, really good question, because if you're an interim person, you'll have more starts than most people. And you'll be new and fresh more in a larger portion of the time. So I've been new and if you take the first 2 months as new and fresh, I've been new and fresh, whatever, at least a year of the last 6-7 years. Whereas for Viktoria, it's only been once when she moved to IWOCA. So I think, thinking really hard about the first 30 days is actually really important as an interim person. You do it lots, and it's also difficult and high stakes because you're being paid on a day rate. You might, on a cash basis, be earning more than anyone in the company, including the CEO. You know nothing about the product when you walk in. You know nothing about the audience. And that combination of being paid the most while knowing the least is one that you need to deliberately kind of manage around. I'll tell you what I do, but these are, I think, people need to develop their own systems that work for their ways of thinking and so on. So I think the system, broadly speaking, you should have some way of doing kind of audit. It might be, let's look at the performance marketing numbers, see how the channels perform down the funnel or whatever. I do a different thing that I'll describe in a sec. So do some kind of audit and then come out with proposals and do some version of that, whether it's a brand focused thing, a numbers focused thing, or a kind of projects and activities focused thing like I do. And do that in the first 30 days, because it helps you get under the skin of what's going on and add some value and sort of exert some control over the situation. What I do, and again, this is my system, but other people have different things they like doing. What I do is to say that I'm going to run my marketing team like most people run their product teams. On the product side, you have roadmaps and sprints. And if you go with a feature idea, they'll say, okay, we'll put it through the roadmap, long listing, short listing process. Best case, it ends up on the Q3 roadmap, and we'll build a kind of an MVP version there. You ask a marketing team what to do in terms of, I've got this channel idea. The answer is totally different. And I'm like, no, I'm going to do that in marketing. So I start by long listing ideas and getting the team to long list every idea they can think of. And you can put them into buckets of performance and brand and infrastructure or whatever it is. Have a spreadsheet with one line per idea, and you're encouraging people to add more and more and more and more and more ideas, capture everything that has ever been said in the business or everyone has ever wanted, get the CEO to input, get engineers to input. By that stage, you'll have 50 lines, 100 lines, and then you sit with the marketing team, filter that down to a smaller list without, it's just discussion based, and then turn that into a roadmap, like literally month by month. What are we going to do in these areas? To draft the roadmap, think about capacity, and start sharing and getting views on that. So that's my process. But I think trying to have something that you lean on, that you are confident at in the first 30 days is actually really, really useful.
That's super useful. Thank you. Thank you for that insight, Jalin. We have a couple more questions, and then we'll start. Yeah, we'll start with the questions from the audience. This one, it could be, but maybe one for you, Viktoria. So, you know, collaboration is key in marketing specifically. So what I wanted to ask was about the relationship specifically between product management and marketing, and what your approach is on working on growth together.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think often, to sort of what I think we spoke about in the beginning, Jalin mentioned, like often marketing either is responsible for parts of what is considered growth, so that funnel optimization and product viral loops and whatnot, or is just very closely, you know, needs to be really closely aligned with it, because obviously whatever you send in the funnel, if the funnel then doesn't work, it doesn't come out the other end. And then you have this problem with why CMOs move on very often, because they, you know, there is a portion of blame. Where did it all go wrong? So I think one thing that is really, really important as a starting point is common objectives and a common set of dashboards or whatever numbers that everyone's looking at. Without that, it's really hard. I mean, growth is a game of numbers in any case. You need numbers, but you need to be looking at the same numbers with the same perspective across marketing and growth. The other thing I think is really clear roles and responsibilities in terms of, like, I've had an experience where we had a sort of a product growth team and then a marketeer assigned to it. And because it was focused on a very sort of marketing type, like the beginning of the funnel, basically, where marketing has very strong opinions about messaging and stuff, it was a constant sort of double like pas de deux between the growth PM and the growth PMM, trying to figure out who is making the decision on what goes on the homepage and what goes on this button and what goes on here in the sign-up flow. And you don't want to do that. That just wastes time. Growth is meant to be fast. So I think figuring out what resources you need, and sometimes you need less resources rather than more to avoid having too many cooks in the kitchen, is really, really crucial. And then figuring out, okay, I'm responsible for this and you're responsible for that, and making that very, very clear. And then I think a couple of other things that really are important is similar to the dashboards. You need the right tools. Like if you don't have a tool to do A/B testing, you'll really struggle with growth. Like you'll have to look at before and after, but then the world has changed. Maybe there's a virus that jumped from pangolins to humans, like things, evolve rather quickly. So you need to have the right tools in order to do that. And if part of it is, in an app, for example, sending notifications and stuff like that, you need to have the right tooling in place. And so for that, you need engineering as well. And I think the other really crucial thing related to the common objectives is figuring out where you can make an impact. To your point about enterprise versus SMB versus B2C, a small improvement in the bottom of the funnel of a sort of 10 or 50K lifetime value type of situation will be a lot more valuable than kind of any sort of anything in the top of that funnel, unless that is by an order of magnitude larger. And you need to be able to figure out which part of the funnel do you want to sort of growth hack on, where is the most potential, and where can you actually measure stuff so that you can see whether your growth hacks are working or not. So I think giving that thought is also really important. Anything I missed, Jalin, on your side?
I'm definitely not the expert on that side of it, so that's good.
Thank you. That's great, Viktoria. Great points. I think we should start with some of the questions from the audience. So the first question is, what is our definition of growth marketing versus performance marketing? Do you want to start off with this one, Jalin?
I'm not a growth marketing expert, but my read on it is the deeper you're going into the funnel, the more it's like growth marketing. And obviously, if you're really deep in the funnel, you're actually talking about the product itself. You've got past the sign-up process, and so on and so on. So yeah, the deeper you are in the funnel, the more it is growth. And in terms of flavor of what you're doing, it's more about product interventions, and you need engineers for that stuff. Marketing, you can do most of it without engineers. You can kind of more or less run a marketing team without any engineers. Once you're in the growth sort of zone, you almost certainly need them.
Yeah.
Victoria's far more experienced at this sort of intersection. So over to you, Victoria.
I think a lot of it is you just need to read the job spec or really talk to the people that you're working with to figure out. Because I think over the last 10 years, like initially when growth started, was exactly what Jalin is talking about. It was very well defined. Is like, how do you take the funnel of the product and do lots of little kind of tweaks and improvements in order to maximize the flow from the top to the bottom. I think over time, marketeers fell in love with that cooler notion of growth hackers, and now a senior growth hacker can be easily a performance lead and vice versa. And so it depends on the organization and how loose they are with their terminology. In theory, performance lead is focused on paid media, and growth hacking is focused on things that don't cost you money necessarily, because you're tweaking the product in most cases. You're using your own, like basically either stuff within your product or your CRM or whatever it is. And so it doesn't cost you money, but it costs you engineers, which is often harder to come by. And so a performance marketer is more often like really knows the ins and out of how to make the black box Facebook machine work, or, how do you combine a, multi-touch attribution across various sort of digital channels, while a growth hacker is meant to be more adept at working in those sort of product cycles and sprints and stuff, and working on owned free channels. But I think the terminology is now, like, lots of people are playing fast and loose with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's why kind of the confusion can come from as well. Great. The next question from the audience is, what is the main difference between an early stage CMO and a late stage CMO?
I think, Jalin, you'd be really great at sort of, you've thought about this a lot.
So earlier stage, there's a marketing team itself. So obviously there's less of a marketing team when you're doing the earlier stuff. So you're necessarily more hands-on. The commercial setting is also, so product, I think there's a question of whether the company has achieved good product market fit. If product market fit isn't there, then you're an early stage marketer sort of scrambling around while the product isn't quite set, which is more uncomfortable, but that's a very, very early stage kind of conundrum. I'd say mid-stage, when you have more or less decent product market fit, but you haven't worked out what the marketing mix is, you haven't, you're doing the iteration on the marketing side, so the recipe hasn't been written, and you don't have much of a team to write it with. That's very early stage. And then once you get to very, very late stage, you've got a big team and the strategy is more or less there. So you're optimizing the strategy, and a lot of it becomes about team management, general management, process, and that kind of thing. So I feel when I'm doing my more, the larger scale-up sort of things, that I'm drawing on when I've been sort of a COO or an ops and strategy guy, because it's a more general management skill set when the team starts getting really large.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jalin. One that would be for both of you is if you both have a particular highlight of your career as a CMO.
Over to you, Victoria. Victoria's got zillions of highlights. I need to scratch my head really hard, so yeah.
You get to.
I'll think while you talk.
I think it depends what really kind of makes you proud, right? What is a highlight for you? I think lots of people in marketing get really, really excited by launching a campaign out there, right? So when you make an ad and you see it riding on buses all across London, there is something amazing in just like that reality of it, which is somehow more real than a digital banner or like a product tweak, or those really super important 5 words on a piece of paper in the middle of a brand process, right? I think another thing that I get really, really excited about is when you make kind of an infrastructural change that really powers things. So like in Google and in IWOCA, I had the opportunity to inspire people to build the first sort of cross-channel, cross-product, full funnel dashboard. And somehow that makes my day much more than seeing the ads on the bus, simply because that's what I personally get excited about. And it powers that connection across marketing, sales, product, ops. And it's a super powerful tool to drive business strategy. And often, marketing, going back to the point of what makes a great CMO or a great exec in general, right, is seeing the white space inside a company and figuring out, okay, actually, I can solve this, whether it's my job or not my job officially, and make it happen. And so I think that, I would categorize that as a highlight.
I think that's such a great point. And I think back to your point about, doing your due diligence about a company, like the more research you do, honestly, the more chances you are going to have of having that highlight, because what is a highlight to you might not be a highlight for anyone else, because that's what makes you tick as well. Jalin, do you want to add anything with any particular highlight for you?
So like I said, Victoria's had many, many highlights. I've had many lowlights, right? In terms of highlights, back in 2017, I think I joined Tide shortly after they'd launched. So Tide, this business challenger bank. And it was a weird proposition because the idea that you'd want to do business banking on your mobile phone seemed at that stage a bit of a risk. But I think George, the founder, George Beavis, is a proper visionary, and he was totally ahead, and he was absolutely bang on with frankly, all of his product thinking. So I joined shortly after they'd launched, and they were just a fast-growing startup there. George had overinvested in marketing, or had quite a big marketing team. So when I joined, it was already 6 or so people, even though it was just barely out of the gates and the thing had just launched. And within 6 months of joining, 1 in 12 new business current accounts being opened in the UK was with Tide. By that point, we were maybe 50, 60 people, whereas the likes of HSBC and RBS would have had thousands of people doing that stuff. So our market share was maybe half of, HSBC's, or certainly some of the smaller banks like Santander. We had half the market share, at least, of new business current accounts off some tiny fraction of the people. And we did it because we were out there trying to write the recipe book. Like, what is this SMB marketing thing for business current account customers? And we tried a bunch of weird and radical things that the banks hadn't done. I'm not going to sort of spill the secrets and this, that, and the other, but suffice to say that there were some interesting, weird, punchy hypotheses that paid off in a really big way that the regular banks still haven't discovered. And I think to do that with a team of what was then growing to 8, 10 people, and steal a march on the banks with their thousands of people felt fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, Jalin. We have a couple more questions before we wrap up. So someone has asked, have you ever been in a position as a marketing growth person in the business, but where you guys were seen more as kind of data rather than a strategic role within the business? And how do you go about reframing the perceptions internally around that? Have you ever been in that situation? I think they are asking, like, if there is someone within the company, that comes from larger traditional businesses that perhaps don't perceive marketing as a strategic part of the business. I think if there are like internal, I guess, challenges around that.
I think the way, going back to this whole point about CMOs are often in struggle and the CMO-CEO relationship is a troubled one, I think one of the reasons is that CEOs and the people that you're working with, the CEO or whoever you're reporting into, they tend to have strong views about marketing in a way that they don't about tech or operations or whatever else. So you are battling against this thing, and sometimes it's just too tough. Like, some people don't believe in brand. They literally will refuse to believe that it could be a serious lever for the business in spite of the evidence. And then, if you're trying to push that argument with them, you will just fail. Like, the feelings are too deep set. But going back to this conundrum where the fear is that marketing could be a data function. Maybe it's qualitative data and competitor intelligence and market intel. Maybe it's quantitative data and you're literally providing funnel stats and user data or something. The proactive thing is to demonstrate the value. In other words, come out with a view for how marketing can add a whole load of value and demonstrate that with some experiments or calcs. And it might still not quite land and you're fighting against preconceptions, but yeah, that's the suggestion. Show where the value can come from, which probably means a couple of weeks of thinking and writing and checking out hypotheses and maybe a bit of covert experimentation before you then go and do that.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Jalin. Another question, you've touched upon that a bit in the beginning when you were talking about the planning on your first 30 days for interim. How is, how does it differ to be managing your client when you're interim to managing your boss when you're in a permanent role?
So in an interim capacity, I think there's a weird tension, because on the one hand, you're hired help, and I think you're less able to put your foot down and say, this is absolutely the way to go when there's disagreements and so on. On the other hand, you're psychologically liberated, because it doesn't feel like your entire future depends on what the CEO or the founder thinks about you. So what I do when I have knotty situations, or there's things to work out that are quite sort of controversial or difficult, is to give options. I'll say, these are our 3 options, and this is the one that I favor. And I'll be very kind of clear about the one that I favor and why. But then if they choose options B or C instead, that's okay. I mean, it's their choice, it's their company. You're not going to have to live with whatever mess ups there are 12 months down the road. They've chosen. So that, yeah, I guess giving options and being very clear about which one you favor is how I sort of reconcile this.
Great. Do you want to add anything to that, Viktoria, or do you want me to ask another question? I think we have 2 more before we.
Yeah, you go for other questions.
Yeah, I think an interesting one for you. Obviously, your career has been more focused on permanent roles. So, how do you know when you're in a current role? How do you know that it's time to look for your next role? Generally, or it's been okay, it's time for me to now move on and maybe either further my career elsewhere or switch industry or roles.
I think for me, it's all about learning curves. I really enjoy learning, and I feel like when you feel like you stop learning and or you're not making an impact, which is like a more serious problem, like that is when you need to start thinking about what's the next move. So that's kind of more of a reactive approach, right? I think there is a proactive approach. There's a school of thought that at any given moment, when you're in a perm role, you need, and I think especially and probably when you're in an interim, but I'd love to hear Jalin's thought on that. You need to build a team that would make you redundant so that you can move on to the next bigger thing. And I think that is when you then don't see a next bigger thing within the company that you're in, then you kind of move on, right? So I think for me at IWOCA, I spent the first 2.5 years building a marketing team, and I've built out kind of strong leadership, and that's why I moved on sort of to product stuff, because I felt like that's where marketing was in good hands and I could move on. But then when I realized that the product learning was not what I was after, then I moved on to where I'm moving on now. So I think that kind of taking that proactive approach of constantly building a team that will effectively means that they don't need you anymore is a good thing.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer, I think. And yeah, it's interesting how it's interesting what you said about building a team that would make you redundant. But it is true. I think then you know that you can move on as well. But thank you both so much.